The United States has great strength and patience, but if it is forced to defend itself or its allies, we will have no choice but to totally destroy North Korea.
Strong rhetoric at the United Nations and an escalation in tensions between the US and the DPRK. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. In his first speech before the United Nations General Assembly, United States President Donald Trump didn't hold back. He challenged Venezuela and Cuba, threatened to walk out of the Iran nuclear agreement, and promised the U.S. would destroy the Democratic People's Republic of Korea if forced to defend itself or its allies. The DPRK's response came Thursday. In a statement, Kim Jong-Un accused Mr. Trump of being mentally deranged, and according to the DPRK Foreign Minister, the country could respond by testing a hydrogen bomb in the Pacific Ocean. For more, we turn now to CGTN's Nathan King at the United Nations. And Nathan, the DPRK's Foreign Minister, Ri Yong Ho, was scheduled to speak to the General Assembly on Friday, but it was moved to Saturday. Yeah. Do we know the reason behind that decision?
I wouldn't read too much into it. And ministers and presidents change their minds on when they're going to speak all the time here at the United Nations General Assembly. In fact, it keeps us journalists on our toes quite a bit. Although, remember, if he'd have spoken today, it would have been perhaps in the shadow of Kim Jong-un's very highly personal statement, unprecedented statement towards US President Donald Trump. So perhaps not sharing the limelight too much with his boss. But we are expecting a speech along similar lines, pointing the finger at the US, especially the rhetoric that we've heard here, of course, at the UN General Assembly from Donald Trump all week.
So do we know when this speech is going to be taking place?
Yeah, in New York time, around about 11:30, 12 in the afternoon, towards the lunchtime here. Obviously, we'll be here bringing it to you as we hear it. It's going to be very anticipated. The big question we have here is he going to, obviously he'll respond to the rhetoric that we've been hearing. Is he going to flesh out some of the threats that have been made about another potentially large nuclear test, but also, will they hold out the prospect of any de-escalation of tensions too?
All right, thanks, Nathan. That's Nathan King reporting there from New York at the United Nations. Well, let's get to the rest of our panel right now. Here in the studio is Brian Becker. He's an analyst on U.S. DPRK relations, and he's visited the DPRK on several occasions. From Florida, Mohsen Milani is the executive director of the Center for Strategic and Diplomatic Studies at the University of South Florida. Also with us, Zhang is the chief correspondent of the Shanghai Wen Hui Daily in the Washington, D.C. Bureau. Thanks to all of you for being with us. Brian, let me start with you. So the DPRK nuclear issue has sunken to the level of name-calling right now, the two leaders having a go at each other. Let's take a look at what they called each other. Kim Jong-un referred to President Trump as a rogue and a gangster and said, "I will surely and definitely tame the mentally deranged U.S. dotard with fire." Trump responded by calling Kim a madman who doesn't mind starving or killing his people. Given that kind of rhetoric, what are the chances of a diplomatic solution right now?
Well, you'd have to say not very good. Yeah. But let's start with Donald Trump, because he was the one who started this. He uses a nickname. Rocket Man is on a suicide mission, referring to the DPRK leadership. Obviously, the DPRK values its leadership a great deal. Perhaps that's the primary point of their political presentation. Why go after Kim Jong-un like that? That's a provocative act. And so Kim Jong-un has now responded with making it personal. The other thing that Donald Trump said, which is unprecedented in a violation of the UN Charter, was to threaten to totally destroy the DPRK. Now, DPRK has 25 million people. The United States did once destroy North Korea. That was a promise of a genocidal proportion. I mean, you can't really do that and then say you're acting as a responsible statesman. From the point of view of the DPRK, that might sound sort of deranged. So I don't think, even though the language might be hyperbolic on both sides, it's not completely confusing from my point of view of why the DPRK would say that. There were other parts of Kim Jong-un's message which are not being taken up by the media, which were less hyperbolic, and they said world leaders should act prudently. they should watch their rhetoric. In other words, it wasn't all fire and fury on the part of the DPRK. Can there be negotiations? Yes, there can. It's not too late. It's not 12 o'clock. It's still 10 minutes to 12. And so now is the time for the United States to take the first step, I think.
Okay, let me bring in Mohsen Milani. And Mohsen, there's a lot of bluster and fury that we're hearing from the United States, talk of destroying the DPRK, as we heard. But yet so far what the US has done in practical terms is to impose more sanctions on the DPRK. So are we seeing a lot of posturing here, and could this posturing be possibly something that would lead up to negotiations?
I certainly hope so, because it seems to me there is no military solution to the crisis in North Korea. And what I mean by this is not that there cannot be a war. There certainly can be a war. But the cost and the consequences of a war, I believe, would outweigh the benefit of negotiations between the United States and North Korea and other major players in the Korean Peninsula.
Song, the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi addressed that particular issue in his address to the United Nations. He called for renewed diplomacy. He called for a denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. But given this heightened rhetoric, how is China seeing this escalation in tensions?
I think Mr. Wang Yi wanted to remind the UN Security, this General Assembly members that we had a very strong kind of consensus just a few years ago. That is September 19 joint statement by 6 parties. From one angle, the DPRK decided to drop its nuclear program. From another angle, America and some other countries promised to normalize their relationship with DPRK, and all the parties were committed to denuclearization of the peninsula. But in the last couple of months, I think the two sides, especially America and DPRK, seem to have already forgotten this kind of commitment. From one angle, DPRK has organized several the nuclear tests and ICBM or other missile tests. From another angle, Mr. Trump has become more radical and rhetorically, and also like Mr. Mattis, Defense Secretary, was saying that there was a military option. And I think Mr. Wang Yi wanted to remind all the concerned parties that still we need to focus on the fundamental interest of all the parties and try to reach a kind of consensus.
Nathan, when we look at these meetings taking place at the United Nations in New York, this is the biggest gathering of world leaders and diplomats in the world. But this year they heard the President of the United States threaten to obliterate an entire nation. What was the response there?
No. Yeah, I mean, there was... You know, Trump's supporters in the US probably liked his blunt language, but he's not playing to that crowd. He's playing to the international community here, and normally words are so diplomatic here that sometimes they're almost meaningless. So it was even blunter in this hall, if you like. And I think a lot of world leaders were very worried. You know, this is the week where everyone comes together and talks about problems, and if they don't solve them, at least, you know, there are new ways of trying to look at them worked out, new approaches for when people go back to their capitals. I can't remember a time here during a United Nations General Assembly when actually a crisis has got worse during the week, largely of the diplomats' own making. And obviously Donald Trump bears some responsibility for that. So everyone's going away here on a Friday, although we've got a few more speeches to go over the next few days, thinking the DPRK crisis has got worse, not better.
Brian, if and when there are going to be negotiations, quite often we find, whether it's this particular issue or any other issue, the two sides normally try to negotiate from a position of strength, whether it's facts on the ground, whether they can change the situation as they go into those negotiations. Pyongyang, the DPRK, now talking about possibly carrying out another hydrogen bomb test. What does it tell us about their intentions? Also, what does it tell us about their technology that they possess?
Their technology has advanced considerably. Even the scientific experts who considered them to be sort of a backward country, an isolated country, a country thus incapable of doing the things that now we can see that they are doing, both in the realm of missile technology and in nuclear technology. They've done a lot, and I think they're very committed to going as far as they possibly can in terms of the advances to demonstrate what they are capable of. They now believe that there's an existential threat to their existence as a nation. And they also believe that this threat has been a drain on their economy. They see nuclear weapons in two ways. One is a deterrent, and secondly, as a way to have a cheaper, more efficient deterrent to that which they consider to be a grave threat. So a big priority for the DPRK government is its own economic program. There has been, in fact, robust economic growth. The sanctions might choke that off. But what the DPRK wants to do, what they believe they have done, is establish a deterrent enough through their missile technology and nuclear technology that the U.S. will be forced or compelled to come to the bargaining table. But you have a very, I consider, arrogant group here in Washington, D.C. that doesn't want to consider itself equal to a small country that's been targeted as the enemy. Can the American policymakers bring themselves to actually come to the table right now and negotiate with the DPRK? I'm not so sure about that. So, you know, if you look back to the last month, the headlines were the drama is easing between the U.S. and the DPRK. Now it's growing. It's growing even on the first week of the General Assembly. I actually believe now the possibility of a military confrontation has grown to be quite great. I wouldn't have thought that 3 or 4 months ago. But both sides are climbing this escalation ladder. It's very hard to get off.
Nathan, you want to say something?
Yeah, I think Brian's absolutely right. And one thing I wanted to stress is Wang Yi, Chinese foreign minister, in his speech almost ignored the rhetoric that we've seen this week from Donald Trump. And he talked about the 4 no's that the US has said. And that was really US Secretary of State Rex Tillerson. And his 4 no's to try and reassure Pyongyang just a few days ago was, look, we're not looking for regime collapse. We're not looking for regime change. We are not looking to reunify the Korean Peninsula on our terms. And we're not going to send US troops north of the 38th parallel. That is what Wang Yi focused on, because that is the beginning of some sort of negotiations if anything happens. I thought it was quite wise to address that rather than try and take on the rhetoric that we've been hearing.